The winter of 1868 had settled heavy over Ashford, Illinois, muting sound and slowing time until the world felt wrapped in cotton. Snow lay thick on the rooftops and draped across the narrow streets, the kind that swallowed footsteps before they reached the next corner. On the hill above the town stood the convent, its stone walls streaked with ice, its narrow windows glowing faintly with the light of beeswax candles. From a distance it was a picture of sanctuary, a place where the unwanted and the desperate could be brought, and where, if the whispered promises were to be believed, a woman could deliver her child in safety without judgment. The townsfolk spoke the name of its keeper, Sister Verena Hale, with a quiet respect usually reserved for saints. She was the kind of woman who never raised her voice, whose pale hands seemed made for blessing foreheads, whose presence had the calm gravity of someone who had looked at grief many times and survived it. They said she had never lost a mother in childbirth, a record of grace no physician in the county could match. They did not see the way her eyes lingered too long on the faces of the dying, nor how she preferred to sit in the darkened chapel long after the others had gone to their beds, her fingers tracing the grooves in the altar as though memorizing each one. Inside the birthing house, the air was warm with the smell of boiled linens and rosemary water. Hymns drifted through the corridors, soft enough to feel like a comfort, yet carrying an undercurrent of something less pure, as if the walls themselves hummed with the memory of other nights, other cries. The rooms were simple, the furniture polished but plain, and yet everything seemed arranged with an unnerving exactness. Chairs placed at precise angles, rosaries wound the same number of times around every bedpost, crucifixes hanging so perfectly level that no human hand could have done it by accident. The novices moved in silence, their eyes lowered, their faces pale as candlelight. They avoided lingering in the same space as Verena unless summoned, as though her presence drew the air tighter in their lungs. To the women brought here, the young mothers cast out by fathers or abandoned by men who swore they loved them, Verena's order appeared as salvation. They were told they would be fed, warmed, kept safe from the cold judgment of the outside world. No one spoke of the fact that once a woman passed through these doors, her fate was entirely in Verena's hands. Verena kept her records in a small wooden desk in her private quarters. It was locked at all times, the brass key worn smooth from years of use. Inside were bound volumes filled with her neat, slanted handwriting, each page ruled with lines of precision. To the casual observer, they might appear to be birth logs, names, dates, and times written with a nurse's discipline. But the truth lay in the final column, a narrow space she called testimony. Here, instead of noting the birth weight or the health of the child, Verena wrote the mother's last words, exact and unaltered, down to the breath between syllables. Sometimes they were pleas for God's mercy, sometimes names whispered like a prayer, sometimes nothing more than a long sigh. Each entry was followed by the minute and second in which that voice fell silent. She did not write the cause of death, nor did she dwell on it aloud. It was not the death itself that mattered to her, but the final moment before it. The precise instant when the soul seemed to loosen from the body. In those seconds she believed something rare and pure passed through, something that could be captured if one only knew how to listen. She had learned early that most people were too frightened to witness such moments with any clarity. They looked away, they cried, they tried to busy themselves with tasks. Verena did not. She leaned in, absorbing every tremor in the dying woman's voice, noting the soft rattle of air, the shape of a final word. It was her private sacrament, one she never spoke of, one the church would never approve yet could never detect. And so she smiled for the townsfolk, nodding politely when they praised her devotion, accepting their gifts of preserves and hand-sewn linens as though she were simply another servant of God. But in the quiet, she would return to her desk, open her ledger, and run her fingers down the columns of names, not to remember the women as they had lived, but to feel again the moment they had passed. Outside, the snow deepened. Soon new footsteps would come up the convent path, bearing women with swollen bellies and eyes full of fear, women who believed they were entering a place of mercy. And Verena would greet them with warmth, her hands steady, her voice calm, her gaze fixed on a future they could not imagine. A future measured in seconds that belonged entirely to her. Over 3 days in the middle of that bitter January, the convent's gate was opened 5 separate times, each for a different young woman. The first arrived just before dawn, her breath forming clouds in the cold, clutching the arm of a parish priest who looked anywhere but at her. She was pale from the journey, her belly round beneath a worn wool coat, and her eyes were fixed on the ground as if afraid that looking at the building might cause it to vanish. The second came in the back of a farmer's wagon, the driver silent as he helped her down and pressed a small cloth bundle into her hands before leaving without a word. The third appeared with her mother trailing a step behind, the older woman's face locked in a grim mask, the kind that says this is the last help she will offer. The fourth came on foot from the rail station, escorted by 2 of the younger priests, their collars gleaming against the gray snow. The fifth walked alone, shivering in an oversized coat, her hair tangled from the wind. None of them spoke to each other, and the nuns did not encourage them to. They were strangers from different towns, but in Verena's eyes they belonged to the same story now. Inside, the long birthing ward waited for them. 5 narrow beds were set in a perfect row against the far wall, each draped in white linen and flanked by a tall crucifix. At first glance, the crucifixes seemed ordinary, but if one looked closely, as none of the women dared, each had a small, round indentation at its center, just beneath where the figure of Christ's chest would be. It was not a flaw in the wood, but a deliberate mark, smooth from touch, as if something sharp had once rested there and had been removed. The floorboards gleamed from fresh scrubbing, and the air smelled of lavender and lye, a clean scent that was almost sharp enough to sting the nose. Candles burned steadily in iron sconces, casting shadows that made the bed frames look taller than they were. The nuns led each woman to her bed without words, placing a small folded blanket at the foot and a glass of water on the stand beside. Verena moved among them with practiced grace, resting a cool hand on each woman's shoulder, murmuring blessings under her breath. She did not ask for their stories, nor did she offer comfort in the way a friend or family member might. Her comfort was procedural, the tightening of a blanket, the smoothing of a pillow, the check of a pulse. In those moments, she was measuring them not in height or weight, but in some inner quality she alone seemed able to see. The 5 women, exhausted from travel and heavy with the strain of their final months, lay back against their pillows, each one silently calculating how much time remained before their labor began. Some feared it would come too soon. Others feared it would take too long. They did not know that Verina's eyes were fixed on them with a different calculation, not of when the child would arrive, but of how precisely she could bring each of them to the same night, the same hour, the same unbroken sequence. Already she was arranging their meals, their rest, their movements. She had learned over years that the body could be coaxed into obedience with the right balance of deprivation and excess. And so, as the snow thickened against the windows, the women closed their eyes to rest, unaware that their paths had already been bent to a design older than any of them. In the quiet of that first night, the candles in the ward burned lower and the shadows lengthened across the row of beds. The 5 crucifixes above them seemed to lean forward ever so slightly, as if listening. And in her private quarters, Verina opened her ledger and on a fresh page wrote each of their names with the same calm hand, leaving a narrow space beside each for a number that did not yet exist but soon would. The sanitation room was not listed in any official convent ledger, nor was it shown to the curious visitors who sometimes came to admire the piety of the sisters. It lay at the end of a narrow hall behind a heavy wooden door whose iron latch never rattled except under Verina's hand. To the unknowing, it might have been mistaken for a laundry, its porcelain basins gleaming under the dim oil lamps, its floor scrubbed until the wood grain blurred into pale lines. But the air inside was wrong, dense, metallic, laced with the sour bite of vinegar and something more bitter, the kind of smell that clings to the back of the throat and makes swallowing an effort. Against the far wall stood a shelf lined with glass jars, each filled with liquids of different hues: cloudy yellows, deep browns, translucent reds that caught the light like old wine. Their cork stoppers were wax-sealed, and their labels bore no words, only small notches carved into the wood of the shelf below them, as though they were part of a private sequence only Verina understood. One by one she brought the women here, guiding them by the elbow as if doing them a kindness. She explained in that same calm tone that the cleansing was important before birth. To purify the senses, to ensure that nothing unholy could cling to them or pass to their child. They were seated in an upright chair fitted with iron stirrups at the base, the kind used by surgeons in city hospitals. Thick linen straps were drawn over their ankles and wrists, not so much to restrain as to keep them still for the blessing, as Verina put it. A strip of white cloth was tied around their eyes, shutting out the weak lamplight and the sight of the jars being chosen from the shelf. The ritual always began the same way. Verina would place her fingers against the hollow behind each ear, feeling the pulse there, murmuring a fragment of Latin under her breath. Then came the liquids. Some were cool and sharp, poured in slow drops into the eyes until the lids twitched and tears ran hot down the cheeks. Others were warm and thick, dripped into the ear canals until the women gasped, their heads jerking against the linen blindfold. For each woman the combination was different, a balance Verina selected as carefully as if she were tuning an instrument. The pain was not searing but strange, a kind of deep discomfort that unsettled the mind as much as the flesh. leaving the women dizzy and disoriented, unable to tell how much time had passed. When the drops were done, Verena would dab their faces with a cloth scented faintly of rosewater, the sweet fragrance almost mocking after what had just been done. She would lean close to whisper that they were clean now, that God's light could find them unhindered. The women were led back to their beds with their vision blurred and a faint ringing in their ears, told to rest, told to breathe slowly. They thought it was over, but Verena knew better. The cleansing was not simply a preparation. It was the first step in breaking them down, in loosening the hold they had over themselves. A mind off balance was easier to guide. A body unsettled was easier to time. Long after they had been returned to the ward, the sanitation room remained warm with the ghost of their breath. The jars on the shelf stood motionless, their contents glinting faintly under the fading lamps. Verena locked the door behind her, sliding the iron bolt into place. She had 5 women now, each one marked in a way they could not see, each one carrying within them the start of a sequence that would end exactly when and how she decided. The room waited in silence, knowing it would be used again before the week was out. The snow had not stopped for 3 days, and the convent's walls seemed to drink in the cold until the stone itself felt like bone beneath the hand. In the ward, the women lay under heavy quilts, their breaths visible in the dim candlelight, unaware that Sister Verena was already shaping their bodies to her design. She had been watching the almanac for months, tracing her finger over a date that the others would never notice. The coming lunar eclipse, a rare alignment that would drape the night in copper shadow. She believed as firmly as she believed in her own heartbeat that births on such a night could open a door between worlds. But for the door to open, the timing had to be flawless. All 5 mothers had to deliver on the same night, their cries and silences flowing into one another without pause, a chain of moments bound together like beads on a rosary. She began with small manipulations. Meals were altered without explanation. The broth thinned for some, made rich and heavy for others. Bread was withheld from one table and replaced with bitter boiled greens at another. Water was rationed, given in careful measure until the women's mouths were dry and their skin faintly cracked. Then, without warning, they were given steaming cups of a dark herbal brew, a bitter resinous drink that clung to the tongue and settled like heat in the belly. The novices served it without meeting anyone's eyes. Within hours, the women's bodies responded. Their muscles tightened, their pulses quickened, a faint ache building low in their spines. Verena recorded each change in her ledger, her face calm, her hands steady as though noting the weather. On the day before the eclipse, she prepared their beds as if for a feast. She stripped each one bare and remade it with fresh linens, tucking a single iron nail beneath the mattress, rusted and bent, its head barely visible if the sheet was lifted. She told the women it was a charm to keep away wandering spirits, a protection from the restless dead. But in her mind it was not protection at all. It was a tether, something to hold them in place when the moment came. As she worked, she hummed a low, tuneless sound that was not part of any hymn the others knew. By evening, the ward felt different, the air thick as if the snow outside had sealed it from the rest of the world. The women shifted restlessly in their beds, their bodies no longer their own. Some labored in shallow waves of pain, enough to steal their breath, but not yet enough to bring the child forth. Others lay still, feeling an unease they could not name, their hearts beating too fast for rest. Verena moved between them without haste, her hand brushing a fevered forehead here, adjusting a blanket there, her eyes flicking to the crucifixes above each bed as if to make sure they had not shifted in the shadows. Night fell early, the sky a bruise above the convent roof. In her quarters, Verena lit a single candle and opened her ledger, the page already marked with the date of the eclipse. She left 5 empty spaces beneath it, each one waiting for the number she sought, the measure of the gap between a mother's last breath and her child's first cry. She would have them all before the night was over. Anna's pains began just before midnight, a sudden jolt that doubled her in the bed and tore a sound from her throat she didn't recognize as her own. The ward was dark except for the candles, their flames wavering in the drafts that slipped under the door. The other women stirred but did not speak, each of them knowing in some unspoken way that this was only the beginning. Verena appeared without hurry, her shadow gliding along the wall before her. She placed a cool hand on Anna's stomach, pressing with a strange precision, as if she could feel the position of every bone and muscle beneath. Satisfied, she ordered the novices to bring the braided cord. It was a length of silk unlike any the women had seen before, pale as bleached bone, thick as a wrist, with small black marks stitched into it that looked like musical notes curling across a hymn sheet. Verena told Anna it would help her focus, that the mind could endure more if the body were made still. She wound the cord around Anna's upper arms above the elbows, pulling it tight until the flesh bulged faintly over the braid. With each contraction, she tightened it further, her hands steady, her face serene. The pressure slowed the blood's return to Anna's heart, making her breath shallow, her vision blur at the edges. The labor was violent and unnatural, each wave hitting faster than the last, leaving Anna gasping, her lips tinged with blue. The child's head crowned, and still Verena held the cord firm, her eyes fixed on Anna's face rather than the birth. The moment the infant slipped free into the waiting hands of a novice, Verena gave one final twist to the silk, collapsing the blood flow entirely. Anna's body shuddered once. Her eyes flickered open as if to say something, and then the air left her for good. The novice handed the baby to another sister without a word, and Verena loosened the cord only when she was certain there would be no return. She took the cord to the small brazier in the corner of the ward, feeding it into the coals until the silk hissed and curled, the black marks glowing for a moment before vanishing in ash. The smell was faintly sweet, clinging to the air in a way that felt both clean and corrupt. Verena returned to her desk in the corner, dipped her pen and wrote in her ledger. Not the time of the birth, not the weight or sex of the child, but the exact second Anna's breath stopped. She paused for a moment, staring at the number as if committing it to memory, then closed the book with a soft, deliberate sound. In the bed where Anna had labored, the sheets were already being stripped, the crucifix above it tilting slightly as the mattress was lifted. The nail beneath it stayed in place, untouched. Verena glanced to the next bed in the row, her gaze lingering on the pale face resting there. The night was far from over, and there were still 4 spaces left to fill. Verena's ledger was older than most of the women who came to her. The leather binding had darkened to the color of dried blood, the corners worn soft from decades of her touch. Inside, the pages were lined with her meticulous hand, names written with the same graceful slant, dates and times recorded with an almost mathematical precision. But it was the final column that told the truth. A narrow strip of space headed only by the word gap. To anyone else, it meant nothing. To Verena, it was the only number that mattered. The gap was the measure between a mother's last breath and her child's first cry. She had begun keeping it years ago, the first time she noticed how some infants wailed the instant they were freed from the womb, while others remained silent until their mother's body had gone completely still. Over time, she had convinced herself that the shorter the interval, the more pure the child's soul, untouched by the confusion of the living world. To her, it was not death that ended life, but that breathless space between, a space she could control. She read through old entries the way others might revisit cherished letters. Her pen had traced over hundreds of women's names, each paired with a number that meant far more to her than their stories or their faces. 2 seconds, 9 seconds, 13. She remembered them all. She remembered the way their eyes had widened in the last instant, the way the room seemed to pause, the air heavy with something she could almost feel pressing against her skin. In those moments, she believed she was standing in a place no priest could reach, where heaven and earth bled together in silence. No one questioned her records. The convent kept its own official ledgers, tidy volumes listing dates of birth, names of fathers if known, the survival of mother and child marked with a cross or a check. Verena's private book existed apart from all that, hidden in the locked drawer of her desk. The other nuns might have wondered why she guarded it so closely, but if they did, they never spoke aloud. Those who had been at her side long enough had learned the cost of curiosity. She never spoke to the women about the gap, but she measured them from the moment they arrived. The tilt of a chin, the strain in a voice, the rhythm of a heartbeat. All of it fed her private calculation of how easily she could bring them to the number she desired. It was not cruelty in her eyes, not murder. It was a shaping, a refinement, like a craftsman bringing a work to its final form. And once she began, there was no deviation from the design. In the ward, Anna's bed was empty now, stripped bare except for the bent iron nail hidden beneath the mattress. The child she had delivered was gone to the upper floor, silent but alive. Verena sat in her quarters with the ledger open, her pen resting just above the next blank space. She did not glance toward the candle burning beside her, nor toward the snow thickening beyond the frosted window. She was listening for the shift in the ward's quiet, for the faint catch in another woman's breathing that would tell her the next labor had begun. When it came, she would rise without hesitation, carrying her book in her mind, ready to close another gap with the precision only she possessed. Ruth's labor began as the moon climbed toward its reddening shadow, the sound of her breathing cutting unevenly through the hushed ward. She had been restless for hours, her hands moving constantly over the blanket as though trying to smooth away her own fear. Verena had been waiting for this. She appeared at Ruth's bedside with a composure that made the moment feel inevitable, her presence settling over the space like a heavy cloth. The other women kept their eyes closed, though none were asleep. They could feel the shift in the air, the way every breath seemed to slow in anticipation. Verena ordered Ruth to be taken to the birthing chair in the far corner of the ward. It was an old thing, carved from oak so dark it drank the candlelight. The seat split open to allow the child to pass through into a basin below. Tonight the basin was not empty. Verena had filled it with salted milk, warmed to the temperature of blood, the steam curling upward into the cold air. She claimed it was a sacred practice, a way to ensure the child was cleansed before it ever touched the earth. But she had not explained why the milk was salted until it stung the skin, or why the scent was strong enough to churn the stomach. Once Ruth was settled, Verena stepped behind her and pressed something small and metallic into her palm. Ruth flinched when she realized it was not meant for her hand, but for her mouth. 2 copper bells, each no bigger than a walnut, their surfaces worn smooth, were slipped between her teeth. Verena instructed her to bite down, saying it would help her focus her strength, that the ringing would mark the rhythm of the contractions. Bound by exhaustion and pain, Ruth obeyed. With each surge, the bells chimed faintly, the sound soft but piercing in the otherwise silent ward. The labor was long and cruel, Verena's hands on Ruth's hips and thighs, adjusting her posture, forcing her body into the angles she wanted. The bells rang irregularly now, sometimes muted when Ruth's jaw loosened in exhaustion, then sharp again when a wave of pain made her bite hard. The child's head appeared, slick and trembling, and Verena's expression sharpened. She leaned close to Ruth's ear and whispered something that no one else could hear. Whatever it was, it made Ruth's eyes widen, a tear sliding down her temple into her hair. When the child finally slipped free into the salted milk, Ruth's body jolted with a final contraction, her jaw snapping shut in reflex. There was a wet, muffled crunch, and the bells rang one last perfect note before they fell silent. Blood spread across her tongue, and her body sagged against the wooden frame. Verena moved with delicate speed, lifting the infant from the basin and wrapping it in a cloth as if nothing had happened. She handed the child to a waiting novice and turned back to Ruth, her fingers brushing the copper bells from her mouth. They were warm now, slick, the soundless weight of them resting briefly in Verena's palm before she set them aside. Ruth's head lolled, her breath gone, her lips pale and slack. Verena touched her cheek almost tenderly, then straightened and made her way to the desk at the far wall. The ledger waited, the page half filled. She dipped her pen and wrote the number that had been forming in her mind for hours. When she set the pen down, she glanced to the next bed, her gaze unblinking. The eclipse had only just begun, and there were still 3 names left to complete the night. Eliza's labor had been stalling since the afternoon, her body resisting the pull that Verena so carefully orchestrated. But as the eclipse reached its deep copper peak, Verena decided the waiting was over. The ward felt suffocating now, the candlelight dim to a red-gold haze, the shadows long and trembling against the walls. Outside, the snow-muted world was silent, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and something sharper, a metallic tang that seemed to seep from the very floorboards. Verena gave the order, and the novices moved like clockwork, wheeling the copper baptismal font into the center of the ward. It was large and round, its surface beaten and darkened with age, and its rim bore tiny dents like teeth marks from some long-forgotten use. The women in their beds turned their faces toward the wall, pretending to sleep, though none could escape the sound of the thick liquid sloshing inside. This was not water. It was the blood of the mothers, Anna's, Ruth's, and now Eliza's, drained slowly from the crook of their arms during labor under the pretext of easing swelling. The surface of the basin rippled with each step the novices took, the deep crimson catching the candlelight like oil. Eliza was guided to the birthing bed nearest the font, her breath ragged, her eyes clouded with exhaustion. Verena did not offer words of encouragement. She simply adjusted the straps that held Eliza's legs apart, tightened the bindings at her wrists, and smoothed a damp cloth over her face. The contractions came hard now, tearing through her with no rhythm, leaving her gasping like a drowning woman. Verena's voice was low, steady, reciting prayers that seemed more like instructions to herself than blessings for Eliza. The child's head emerged slowly, the skin around it drawn taut and pale in the flickering light. When the infant was freed, Verena lifted it without ceremony, its tiny body slick and glistening. She walked the short distance to the font, holding the newborn with a grip that was firm but not cruel, and lowered it into the warm red basin. The blood lapped at its skin, coating it from crown to heel, its mouth opening in a soundless gasp before the air filled with a single piercing cry. Verena counted the seconds under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then raised the child out, cradling it against a clean white cloth. She turned to a novice and handed the baby over, her hands leaving faint red prints on the linen. Eliza's breathing had slowed to a faint, shallow flutter. Her lips moved as if to speak, but no words came. Only a final exhale that trembled in the air for a moment before disappearing into the stillness. Verena reached for the black thread and needle laid out beside the bed, her movement smooth and deliberate. She sewed Eliza's lips shut in 3 neat stitches, pulling the thread tight so no sound, no prayer, no wail that could escape, not even in death. When the task was finished, Verena stood, her face calm, and crossed the ward to her desk. She opened the ledger to the waiting page, dipped her pen, and wrote the number beside Eliza's name. 3 entries now marked, the ink drying in perfect lines. Without looking up, she murmured to herself that the sequence was holding, that the gaps were as narrow as she had hoped. Then she lifted her head, her eyes settling on the 2 women still breathing in their beds. The night was thinning, but there was still time to finish the work. Margaret had been watching the others vanish one by one, her fear sharpening with every muffled sound that rose and died in the ward. She had not slept since Anna's bed was stripped. Now, with only 2 women left, she understood that survival was no longer a matter of luck. When her pains began in the small hours before dawn, she grasped Verena's wrist with surprising strength and whispered that she would do anything, anything. If only she could live. She promised to take vows, to serve the convent for the rest of her life, to never speak of what she had seen. Verena listened, her expression softening into something almost maternal. She nodded as though the plea had touched her, and told Margaret there was a way, but it required a final cleansing. She spoke of it as a test, a baptism of the body before God could grant her life. Margaret agreed without hesitation, thinking she had secured her safety. But Verena's version of cleansing was unlike anything Margaret could have imagined. They led her down a narrow stair into the convent cellar, the stone walls sweating with cold. In the center of the room stood a wide oak barrel brimming with ice water, the surface filmed with frost that cracked when touched. The novices moved silently, pouring in jars of pungent tinctures whose fumes burned the throat and nose. Camphor, vinegar, and something sharper that made the eyes water instantly. Verena instructed Margaret to climb in, saying the shock would drive out every trace of impurity before her child entered the world. The moment Margaret's body sank into the water, she screamed, the sound swallowed by the stone. The cold seized her chest, and the tinctures stung like open flame against her skin. Verena pressed her hands to Margaret's shoulders, forcing her down until the liquid covered her belly. Her contractions came in violent spasms, each one stealing her breath faster than the cold could. The novices stood at the barrel's edge, their eyes fixed on the surface, watching the ripples spread and fade. The child emerged into the freezing mixture, its first breath a thin, pitiful gasp. Verena lifted it out with steady hands, her own skin reddened by the cold, but her face serene. She wrapped the infant in a wool blanket and passed it to a novice without looking back. Margaret's head had slumped against the rim of the barrel, her lips tinged gray, her eyes open but unfocused. The tremors in her limbs slowed, then stopped entirely, her body still half submerged in the icy red-tinged water. Verena stepped back, peeling off her wet sleeves with slow precision. She gave the order for Margaret's body to be taken upstairs, her tone no different from one who might ask for the linens to be changed. In her quarters, she opened the ledger and wrote the number that had hung in her mind since Margaret's first cry of pain. 4 entries now, the ink glistening under the lamplight. Only one bed in the ward remained occupied. The sky beyond the frost-glazed windows was beginning to pale, but the night's work was not yet complete. Verena closed the ledger with a sound like a final breath and turned toward the door. Clara had lain awake through every moment of the night, her body tight with dread long before the first contraction came. She had heard the muffled cries, the sudden silences, the hurried footsteps on the floorboards, and she knew, though she could not admit it even to herself, that she would not leave this place alive. When the pain struck at last, it was almost a relief, the waiting finally over. Verena appeared at her bedside with the same calm she had shown the others, her presence somehow heavier now that she stood over the final mother of the night. Clara was guided not to the birthing chair or the cellar, but to a narrow bed drawn close to the center of the ward. At its foot stood a tall, silver-framed mirror, angled perfectly so that Clara could see the space between her knees without turning her head. She flinched at the sight, but Verena told her it was necessary, that a mother should witness the moment of her child's arrival so the bond might be sealed in purity. 2 novices held Clara steady as Verena bound her wrists to the bed frame, the cord pulling tight enough to bite the skin. The contractions came hard and fast, wringing sobs from her throat. Each time Clara cried out, Verena gave a small nod, and one of the novices stepped forward with a pair of shears to cut away a lock of Clara's hair. The strands fell into a glass jar half filled with vinegar, where they floated briefly before sinking. The scent rose sharply into the air, stinging Clara's eyes and nose. She watched the jar slowly fill, dark hair suspended in the pale liquid, each piece a record of her pain. Hours passed this way, the mirror catching every grimace, every tremor. The light in the ward shifted from the dim red of the eclipse to the ashen blue of early morning. Sweat slicked Clara's face, her eyes glassy, her strength draining with each contraction. The jar of hair was nearly full now, the vinegar darkened by the swelling mass. Finally, with a low, desperate cry, the child slipped free into Verina's waiting hands. There was no tenderness in the way she lifted it, no pause to comfort either mother or newborn. The infant was passed to a novice, swaddled and carried away without a backward glance. Clara's head lolled to the side, her eyes still fixed on the mirror as though the image there might shift if she stared long enough. Her breath came shallow, uneven, then stopped entirely. The silence in the ward closing around her like water. Verena stepped to the table, lifted the jar of hair and turned it slowly in her hands, watching the strands swirl in the vinegar. She affixed a label in her own neat script. Witness. In her quarters, the ledger lay open, the last blank space on the page waiting. Verena dipped her pen and wrote the number with a satisfaction that was neither joy nor relief, but something colder, completion. 5 names, 5 numbers, the sequence unbroken. Beyond the walls, the pale light of morning spread over the snow, but inside the convent, the air still held the heaviness of the night's work. A weight that no prayer could lift. The sun had risen hours before the convent stirred, its pale light sliding over the snow-blanketed grounds, revealing no trace of the night's work. In the ward, the beds stood stripped and bare, the crucifixes above them casting long shadows against the wall. The only sound was the faint creak of floorboards as the novices moved under Verena's direction, carrying the shrouded bodies one by one through the back door. The air outside was so cold it seemed to freeze the breath, mid-exhale. But the women worked without hesitation, their hands steady as they lowered each body into the earth. The graves lay in a neat row behind the convent, far from the road, just beyond the reach of the chapel bell's toll. There were no markers, no names carved into wood or stone, only the clean white surface of snow, which would soon cover the disturbed soil completely. The wind swept over the open ground, carrying a thin, high whistle that tangled in the ears like a half-forgotten lullaby. One novice paused to glance over her shoulder toward the ward windows, but Verena's voice cut through the stillness, low and firm, sending her back to work. When the last grave was filled, the sisters knelt in a circle and sang a hymn, their voices trembling in the cold. The melody was meant to be comforting, a farewell to the souls they claimed to guide heavenward. But there was a falter in the harmony, a catch in the breath of those who had seen too much. The snow began to fall again, fine as sifted ash, and within minutes the ground lay smooth and untouched, as though nothing had been disturbed. Inside, the newborns were already gone, bundled and sent to distant orphanages before the sun had fully risen. No one would ask where they came from. No one would know the names of the women who had carried them. In the empty ward, Verena moved from bed to bed, replacing linens, straightening the crucifixes so they hung perfectly level once more. She did not linger on the spaces where the mothers had labored and died. Her thoughts were fixed on the ledger waiting in her quarters, its fresh page filled at last with the night's perfect sequence. When she returned to her desk, she opened the book and ran her fingers over the 5 completed entries. The ink had dried to a deep, even black, each number precise, each gap exactly as she had intended. Yet for the first time in years, her hand trembled slightly as she closed the cover. She told herself it was the cold. But in the silence that followed, she could hear the faintest sound, something almost like a breath, rising from nowhere, as if the earth outside was not as still as it seemed. It was 23 years before the truth bled through the walls of the Ashford Convent. In the winter of 1891, an aging nun lay dying in a small parish infirmary 2 towns away. Her body wasted, her lips cracked from fever. The priest at her bedside thought she would ask for last rites and the comfort of Scripture. Instead, her voice rasped out fragments of a story so dark he found himself leaning in, unable to believe the words even as he heard them. She spoke of the 5 mothers' night, of the old oak chair, the salted milk, the jars, the cord, and the sound of bells that had never rung again. She named Sister Verena Hale, not as a savior of the vulnerable, but as their executioner. She spoke of a ledger kept in a locked desk where births were recorded not in joy, but in seconds stolen between life and death. The priest's hand tightened around his rosary as she described the smell of vinegar and blood that had clung to the halls, the graves dug behind the convent before the sun had risen, and the way the snow always seemed to fall heavier over them, as if it too wished to hide what lay beneath. When her voice failed, she clutched at his sleeve and whispered that God had turned his face from that place long before the town ever did. She asked him to take the secret to the grave if he feared the church's wrath, but to write it down if he feared for his own soul. When she died that night, the priest sat alone for hours, the fire in the hearth burning low. By dawn, he had written the confession word for word, sealing it in an envelope marked for the diocesan archive. It was filed away in a locked cabinet, its edges yellowing with dust, never to be read aloud in his lifetime. The official reason for its secrecy was to preserve the dignity of the deceased. The unofficial reason was the same as it had been in 1868. To protect the institution. That same year, workmen digging a drainage channel behind the now quiet convent unearthed 5 small wooden crosses buried deep in the frozen earth. There were no names on them, only Roman numerals carved in a hand so careful the marks had not faded. The foreman reported it to the local priest, who instructed the men to cover them over, saying they were likely remnants of an old cemetery. Within a day, the ground was sealed again, the snow undisturbed, the earth once more holding its silence. But for those who had heard the confession, the image lingered. 5 crosses in a neat row, hidden in the shadow of a building where the candles still burned each night, and where the air, even after all these years, carried the faint trace of something unholy. The convent closed quietly in 1904, its doors shuttered under the official claim of financial strain and dwindling numbers of new sisters. The locals accepted this explanation without question, though a few older townsfolk muttered that it had been a long time coming. By then, the once pristine building was weathered and gray, the bells rarely rung, the grounds choked with weeds where gardens had once grown. The windows, still lined with iron crucifixes, reflected nothing but the flat gray sky. What happened to the remaining sisters was never made public. Some were transferred to other convents, others simply vanished from the records. Sister Verena Hale's name appeared nowhere in the church's official history after 1882, as if she had simply dissolved into the air. Rumors clung to the building long after the last candle was snuffed. Farmers passing on winter nights swore they heard faint cries rising from the back of the property, the kind of sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than above it. A few claimed to have seen small, pale shapes moving between the trees on moonless nights, the size of children, but too still, too quiet. No one went close enough to find out for certain. Decades later, when the property was finally sold for demolition, the workmen found the ledgers. They were discovered in a false compartment at the back of an old writing desk. The leather bindings cracked, the pages filled with neat slanted script. There were 327 names, each paired with a number in the gap column, ranging from a single second to nearly a minute. No causes of death, no medical notes, just the measurements written with such precision it was as if the writer believed they could trap the soul on paper. Historians who examined them argued about their meaning, some calling it the work of a misguided midwife obsessed with timing, others insisting it was ritual, perhaps even sacrificial. The church denied the ledgers entirely, calling them forgeries planted by those eager to tarnish its history. No law was ever passed in the mothers' names. No inquiry was made into the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of deaths the books implied. The children who had lived grew into adulthood, never knowing their origins. They married, had families, and died, leaving behind lines of descendants who had no idea their existence had been purchased at the cost of another's final breath. The land where the convent once stood became a blank field, the ground seeded with grass that grew thick and green over what had been buried there. But for those who had touched the brittle pages of Verena's records, the memory could not be erased. They remembered the cold care of her script, the unbroken columns of numbers, and the sense that the work had not been madness but method. A design carried out without hesitation, hidden in the silence of a place that had been called holy. Evil does not always arrive with a knife in hand or the stench of blood trailing behind it. Sometimes it wears clean linen and speaks in a voice as calm as a prayer. Sister Verena Hale had hidden in plain sight, protected not only by the stone walls of the convent, but by the very idea of what a convent was meant to be. She had worked in silence under the cover of service, her methods so deliberate that even those who helped her could not fully name what they had done. It was not frenzy, it was not rage. It was the cold patience of a mind convinced it was shaping something greater than itself. And that is what made it so enduring. The Ashford convent is gone now, its stones scattered, its foundations buried beneath a field that bends in the wind like any other. Children play there in the summers, and in winter the snow smooths every surface until the land looks untouched. But memory does not fade with demolition. It lingers in the minds of those who have read the confession or touched the pages of the ledger. And it lives in the unease that settles over anyone who walks that ground without knowing why. The story never reached the courts, never made the newspapers. It passed instead through whispers folded into the town's private history like a bad dream. Evil like Verena's depends on silence, the silence of those too afraid to speak, of institutions that prefer their walls unstained, of neighbors who convince themselves they must have misunderstood. And when silence is complete, evil survives unchanged, ready to surface again in another face, another uniform, another building held sacred by the world outside. The truth is not that such things happened long ago and could not happen again. The truth is that they happen still, hidden behind the same protections, shielded by the same reluctance to believe. So the question remains: how many Verena Hales have lived and died without their names ever leaving the shadows? How many ledgers have been burned? How many graves left unmarked beneath land that looks ordinary? And if the mask of goodness can cover such cruelty once, what would stop it from doing so again? What do you think? Could this happen?